The moment Madeline Brooks stepped into the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, she knew something was wrong. The chandeliers above Fifth Avenue glittered like judgmental eyes, reflecting diamonds, silk gowns, and tailored tuxedos worth more than her entire life before marriage. The air smelled of expensive perfume and quiet cruelty. This was not a place for a woman 7 months pregnant, wearing a simple navy maternity dress, standing 2 steps behind her husband like an accessory no one wanted to acknowledge. Christopher Langford, CEO of Langford Entertainment Group, didn't look back at her once. Cameras flashed as he walked ahead, smiling for investors, shaking hands with senators, laughing too loudly. On his arm was Serena Vale, America's darling pop icon, her fingers resting where a wife's hand should have been. She wore confidence like armor, red lips curved in a knowing smile that never reached her eyes. Madeline felt her baby shift inside her, a sharp reminder that she was still real, even if everyone else treated her like a shadow. Whispers followed her across the marble floor. "That's her? She looks exhausted. I heard she used to sing. A long time ago." Madeline kept her eyes down. She had learned that survival, in this marriage, meant silence. Tonight was supposed to be a charity gala celebrating art, innovation, and women's empowerment. The irony sat heavy in her chest. She remembered when Christopher used to hold her hand. Before the boardrooms, before the contracts, before he asked her to quit music because it didn't fit the brand of his future. She reached the edge of the crowd just as Serena turned toward the stage, microphone already in hand. "Before I perform," Serena said sweetly, her voice amplified through the room, "I heard we have a special guest tonight, Christopher's wife, Madeline." A pause. Then, soft laughter. Serena tilted her head, eyes locking onto Madeline. "Didn't you study music once? Why don't you come up here and sing something for us? Just for fun." The room stilled. All eyes turned. Madeline looked at Christopher, waiting for him to say no. To protect her. To remember she was carrying his child. He only adjusted his cufflinks and nodded once. That single motion felt like a verdict. Madeline's hands trembled as a staff member approached with a microphone. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the room could hear it. She took one step forward, unaware that this humiliation was about to become the moment that destroyed everything Christopher thought he controlled. And as she reached for the microphone, someone powerful in the room finally recognized her. Madeline Brooks had not always been invisible. There was a time, years before the Langford penthouse and the carefully worded prenuptial agreement, when her voice filled small auditoriums and cracked something open in the people who heard it. She grew up in a quiet New Jersey town, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts and believed that talent meant nothing if you didn't protect it. Madeline learned early how to swallow fear, how to perform, even when her knees shook. Music was the one place she felt whole. At 23, she was accepted into a private vocal program in Manhattan. The kind with glass-walled studios, Steinway pianos, and instructors who spoke in hushed tones about rare range and international potential. That was where Jonathan Pierce first heard her sing. He told her she had a voice that couldn't be manufactured, only destroyed or protected. She laughed, not knowing how close to the truth that was. Then she met Christopher. Back then, he wasn't a CEO. He was a sharply dressed entrepreneur with ambition burning behind polite manners. He attended one of her recitals with a mutual friend and waited afterward, flowers in hand, telling her she was extraordinary. Madeline believed him. She believed the dinners, the long talks about the future, the promises that love didn't require sacrifice of self. She was wrong. The first request came gently. "You're exhausted," Christopher said. "Maybe take a break from singing." The second came with logic. "My world is complicated. Your schedule makes it harder." By the third, it was framed as love. "If you trust me, you'll let this go. Just for now." She quit the program 3 months later. Marriage followed quickly. Then pregnancy. Then the contracts. Christopher's lawyers called it protection. She called it confusing paperwork signed while nauseous and hopeful. The clauses were subtle but ruthless. No claim to intellectual property, no public performances without approval, no shared ownership of image or brand. If the marriage failed, she left quietly. And she stayed quiet. As Christopher's company rose, Madeline shrank. She learned which dinners to attend and which to skip, which smiles to wear, which opinions to bury. When Serena Vale entered his orbit, the change was immediate. The late meetings, the guarded phone calls, the way Christopher stopped touching Madeline's stomach when the baby kicked. Still, she told herself it was temporary. That loyalty meant endurance. Tonight shattered that lie. Standing near the stage at the Plaza Hotel, Madeline felt years of erasure pressing down on her chest. This wasn't just humiliation. It was a public declaration that she had no value outside the role Christopher allowed her to play. She glanced around the room, at faces lit with curiosity instead of concern. At Serena, calm and predatory. At her husband, composed, already distancing himself. Madeline inhaled slowly, steadying her breath the way she used to before performances. Not because she wanted to sing, but because something inside her refused to disappear quietly again. She didn't see Jonathan Pierce yet. She didn't know the sound system had been altered. She only knew that the silence stretching across the ballroom felt dangerous, and that once she opened her mouth, there would be no way to return to who she had been before this night. And as she stepped toward the stage, the man who taught her voice its true worth finally looked up in recognition. Serena Vale had mastered the art of control long before she stepped onto that stage. To the public, she was America's sweetheart, with a razor-sharp voice and a carefully rehearsed vulnerability that sold out stadiums. To the industry, she was a calculated force who knew exactly when to smile, when to cry, and when to destroy someone without ever raising her voice. Tonight, wrapped in a couture gown that shimmered under the lights, Serena looked every bit the untouchable star. She watched Madeline from the stage with open amusement. The pause she created after calling Madeline's name was deliberate. Silence was her favorite weapon. It allowed the room to lean in, to judge, to measure the worth of the woman standing frozen near the edge of the crowd. Serena could feel the shift in energy, the curiosity turning sharp, the pity souring into something crueler. She leaned toward the microphone again. "Don't be shy," Serena said lightly. "We're all friends here. And I hear pregnancy makes emotions stronger. Music should come from emotion, right?" Soft laughter rippled through the ballroom. Madeline felt her face burn. The words were polite, but the message was clear. This was not an invitation. It was a command wrapped in charm. She looked once more at Christopher, searching for any sign of hesitation. He gave her none. His expression was calm, professional, almost relieved that the attention was no longer on him. That was when Madeline understood. This wasn't about Serena's ego alone. Christopher had allowed this because it benefited him. If Madeline embarrassed herself, it reinforced the narrative he had quietly built that she was fragile, outdated, no longer relevant. A liability he tolerated out of obligation, not love. Serena turned to Christopher with a smile meant only for him. "You don't mind, do you?" she asked, though the answer was already decided. "Of course not," he replied smoothly. "If Madeline wants to." The word "wants" landed like an insult. A stage assistant approached Madeline, holding out a microphone with a practiced, sympathetic look. Madeline's fingers closed around it before she could think. The weight of it felt unfamiliar, heavier than she remembered, like something borrowed from a past life she was no longer allowed to claim. As she took her first step toward the stage, she noticed Serena signal subtly to the sound technician. It was quick, almost invisible, but not accidental. Madeline didn't know what it meant yet, only that Serena's smile widened in satisfaction. From the front row, several investors leaned back in their chairs, interest sharpening. Phones were already lifting, ready to capture whatever happened next. Not because they cared about Madeline, but because humiliation was entertaining when it belonged to someone else. Madeline reached the stage and stood beneath the lights, the heat pressing down on her skin. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She could feel the baby move again, unsettled by her rising panic. For a brief, dangerous moment, she considered setting the microphone down and walking away. But she knew what that would mean. She would be the woman who couldn't even try, the weak wife, the burden everyone whispered about. Leaving would give Serena exactly what she wanted. Serena stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Madeline could hear. "Let's see if you still remember how," she murmured, sweet as poison. The band waited. The room waited. Madeline lifted the microphone to her lips, unaware that the sound system had been adjusted to make her fail, unaware that this setup was meant to break her completely. She closed her eyes, and in that split second before she sang, someone in the audience leaned forward sharply, recognition flashing across his face. because the woman Serena was trying to destroy was not who she thought she was at all. The first note was supposed to fail. That was the plan Serena Vale had approved, with a glance and a nod to the sound technician moments earlier. The microphone Madeline held had been subtly altered, the levels set just low enough to thin her voice, just sharp enough to expose any weakness. It was a professional humiliation, the kind that could be blamed on nerves instead of sabotage. Madeline didn't know that. She only knew the ballroom was holding its breath. As the opening piano chord drifted through the speakers, she felt the floor beneath her heels tremble. The lights were blinding, washing the faces in front of her into a sea of shadows. Somewhere beyond them were people who had decided her worth before she opened her mouth. People who expected her to crack. Her lips parted. The first sound that came out was quiet, almost fragile. A few guests exchanged looks. Serena relaxed slightly, her smile returning as she leaned back, confident she had won. Christopher folded his arms, preparing for the inevitable embarrassment that would end this quickly. Then Madeline adjusted her stance. It was an unconscious movement, muscle memory from years of training she thought she'd lost. She shifted her weight, grounded herself, and drew a deeper breath than anyone expected from a woman 7 months pregnant. Her shoulders lowered, her jaw relaxed. The second note changed everything. It wasn't loud, but it was pure. Full-bodied, unmistakably controlled. A ripple moved through the room. The microphone, meant to betray her, now carried a voice that refused to be diminished. Madeline's tone deepened, steady and rich, wrapping around the melody instead of chasing it. The piano player hesitated, startled, then followed her lead. Serena straightened. That wasn't supposed to happen. Madeline opened her eyes, focusing not on the crowd, but on a point somewhere beyond the chandeliers, beyond the judgment. She sang the way she used to in practice rooms late at night, when no one was watching, when the sound belonged only to her. Each phrase carried restraint, discipline, and something sharper underneath years of silence breaking free. Whispers spread, no longer mocking. Is that Liv? She's trained. Everyone. Who taught her? Christopher's expression shifted from boredom to confusion. He glanced toward the sound booth, then back to Madeline. This wasn't the weak performance he had allowed himself to expect. This was not a wife embarrassing herself. This was a woman reclaiming something. Serena stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her confidence cracking. She caught the technician's eye and shook her head sharply, signaling to lower the levels further. The response came too late. Madeline had already adapted, instinctively compensating, projecting past the equipment. Her voice climbed, not in a showy way, but with precision. A controlled ascent that made trained musicians in the audience lean forward. Phones rose higher now, not out of cruelty, but disbelief. The narrative had changed, and everyone could feel it. Madeline felt it too. For the first time that night, the shaking in her hands stopped. The fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into focus. She wasn't singing to survive anymore. She was singing because she could. From the third row, a man with silver at his temples froze mid-applause, his eyes locked on her face. Memory struck him hard and fast. He knew that voice. He had searched for it for years. Jonathan Pierce leaned forward slowly, heart pounding. On stage, Serena's smile finally vanished. And Christopher, staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, realized with creeping dread that he had made a mistake he could not undo. Because this performance was no longer a joke, and the room was about to turn against them. Madeline reached the middle of the song, and something irreversible happened in the room. The polite tension that had hovered over the gala dissolved into a heavier silence, the kind that meant people were listening not out of courtesy, but instinct. This was no longer background noise for wealthy donors sipping champagne. This was a moment that demanded attention. Her voice moved with discipline, not desperation. Each note landed clean, controlled, and deliberate. She didn't oversing. She didn't beg for approval. She trusted the music to carry what words never had. The melody wrapped around the room, slipping past designer dresses and expensive egos, settling somewhere uncomfortable and honest. Several musicians exchanged looks. This wasn't amateur technique. This was training that cost years, money, and sacrifice. Christopher shifted where he stood. His jaw tightened as he scanned the audience. This was not how it was supposed to go. He had agreed to this humiliation because it was safe, because it would remind everyone, including Madeline, of her place. Instead, eyes were turning away from Serena and toward the woman he had reduced to silence. Serena felt it too. She stepped back from the spotlight, her fingers tightening around her own microphone. This was not the kind of attention she controlled. This wasn't scandal or mockery. This was respect, and it was dangerous. She leaned toward the sound technician again, her voice sharp, demanding adjustments. But Madeline had already moved beyond the trap. Her breathing was steady now, her posture open. The baby inside her shifted again, and instead of panic, she felt grounding. She placed a hand lightly against her stomach between phrases, not for show, but reassurance. She was still here. She was still capable. A woman near the front dabbed at her eyes, surprised by her own reaction. A man beside her straightened, expression unreadable. Phones that had been raised for spectacle now recorded with something closer to awe. Christopher caught a fragment of conversation behind him. Why didn't we know about her? She's better than half the industry. Dinan, tender. This changes things. His chest tightened. This was slipping out of his control. Madeline approached the most difficult part of the song, a section that demanded restraint rather than volume. It was the kind of passage that exposed flaws immediately. Serena had expected this to be the breaking point. Instead, Madeline softened. She pulled the sound inward, allowing the room to lean closer rather than pushing against it. Her voice thinned just enough to carry vulnerability without weakness. The effect was devastating. The room leaned forward as one, suspended in the space she created. Jonathan Pierce stood slowly. The movement was subtle, but those who knew him noticed. A man like him didn't rise without reason. His eyes never left Madeline's face, memory crashing into recognition. The posture, the phrasing, the instinctual control no one taught twice. Christopher noticed Jonathan standing and felt a sudden, cold dread. Serena followed his gaze and stiffened. She knew that man. Madeline reached the final phrase of the piece. The note wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was sustained, unwavering, held with a confidence that settled into the room like truth. When it ended, the silence that followed was not awkward. It was reverent. For one suspended second, no one clapped. No one breathed. Then Jonathan Pierce brought his hands together, slow and deliberate. The sound echoed like a signal. And with that single clap, the balance of power in the room began to shift. The applause didn't come all at once. It started unevenly, scattered through the ballroom like raindrops testing the ground. One table, then another, then a ripple that spread faster than Serena Vale could stop it. Within seconds, the sound filled the space, rising to a standing ovation that felt less like celebration and more like acknowledgement. Madeline stood frozen, microphone still in her hand. Her chest rose and fell as she tried to process what had just happened. Her ears rang, not from the volume, but from the sudden absence of fear. For the first time in years, no one was looking at her as Christopher Langford's wife. They were looking at her as something else. Someone else. Jonathan Pierce's applause was different. He clapped slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving Madeline's face. With each measured strike of his palms, memories sharpened. A young woman in a rehearsal room, barefoot on a scuffed wooden floor. A voice that had made him cancel meetings. A talent he had warned could disappear if mishandled. He moved forward, ignoring the murmurs spreading around him. People noticed. They always did when Jonathan Pierce shifted direction. Board members leaned toward one another. Investors whispered. Phones turned, recording not Madeline now, but the man approaching the stage. Christopher felt it like a pressure in his chest. Jonathan Pierce was not supposed to be here tonight. He was a silent partner, a distant investor, a name Christopher referenced when it benefited him and avoided when it didn't. The man rarely attended public events, and when he did, he never involved himself in spectacle. Him standing up, walking toward the stage, meant something was very wrong. Serena's fingers curled into her palm. She recognized the danger too late. Jonathan stopped a few feet from Madeline, close enough for her to see the intensity in his eyes. Not judgment, not pity, recognition. Something about it made her throat tighten. You kept your breath support, he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest tables. Even under pressure. Madeline blinked, stunned. She hadn't heard anyone speak to her like that in years, like a professional, like an equal. I had to, she replied, her voice barely steady, or I would have fallen apart. Jonathan gave a short nod, almost a smile. You didn't. A murmur rippled outward. Christopher stepped forward, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Jonathan, this is quite a surprise," he said smoothly. "We were just having a bit of fun." Jonathan turned slowly. The room went quiet again. "Fun," Jonathan repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what you call setting someone up to fail?" Christopher's smile stiffened. "I don't know what you're implying." "I think you do," Jonathan replied. His gaze flicked briefly to the sound booth, then back. That microphone adjustment was amateur. Whoever ordered it underestimated her. Serena's breath caught. Madeline's heart began to race again, not with fear this time, but realization. This hadn't been her imagination. The humiliation had been planned. Jonathan raised his voice slightly, enough for the room to hear. "For those of you wondering," he said calmly, "Madeline Brooks was accepted into one of the most selective private vocal programs in Manhattan 8 years ago. I personally sponsored her audition." A sharp intake of breath echoed somewhere. Christopher's face drained of color. Madeline stared at Jonathan, shock flooding through her. You remember me?" "I never forgot you," Jonathan said simply. The words landed heavier than applause ever could. Serena took a step back, her confidence finally fracturing. Because this was no longer about a song. It was about exposure. And Jonathan Pierce was about to say something that would shatter every lie Christopher had built. The ballroom felt smaller now, as if the walls had moved closer to contain the truth, pushing its way out. Christopher Langford straightened his jacket, instinctively reclaiming the posture that had carried him through hostile boardrooms and ruthless negotiations. This was familiar territory to him. Pressure, optics, control. He smiled thinly, the expression he used when he believed he could still steer the narrative. "Let's be clear," Christopher said, projecting confidence. "My wife made personal choices. I never forced her to do anything. Tonight's performance was spontaneous." "Jonathan is overreacting." A few nods followed. Old habits died hard. Power still intimidated. Jonathan Pierce didn't argue. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a slim tablet. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, the way one moved when the outcome was already decided. Murmurs rippled again. People recognized the posture of someone about to present evidence, not opinion. "Since we're clarifying," Jonathan said evenly, "let's talk facts." He tapped the screen once. The massive display behind the stage, originally set to cycle through donor names and charity slogans, flickered. Then froze. The gala organizers scrambled, whispering urgently, but Jonathan had already connected. A document appeared. It was a contract. Several executives leaned forward, recognizing formatting, language, clauses they'd seen countless times before. Corporate, precise, cold. Jonathan pointed calmly. "This is a personal services and image control agreement, signed 6 years ago." Madeline's breath hitched. She recognized it instantly, the pages she'd skimmed while pregnant, nauseous, trusting. The document, Christopher's lawyers had told her, was standard. Christopher's face darkened. "That document is confidential." "It was," Jonathan replied, "until it became relevant to corporate governance." Gasps rippled through the room. Jonathan scrolled. Clauses highlighted themselves in soft red. Clause 14. No public performances without spousal approval. Clause 17. Forfeiture of professional representation upon marriage. Clause 19. Financial penalties for breach. The room went still. "This," Jonathan continued, "is not a marriage agreement. It's a suppression contract." Serena Vale took a step back, heels unsteady. This was spiraling far beyond humiliation. Her name appeared on the screen next, attached to an addendum. Madeline stared, shock washing over her. Jonathan turned slightly toward Serena. "You signed on as a brand stabilizer," he said calmly. "Your role was not just promotional, it was strategic. Replacement optics." Serena's lips parted, but no sound came out. Christopher snapped. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Jonathan replied, swiping again. An audio waveform appeared. The room held its breath. A voice played. Christopher's voice, distorted only slightly, unmistakable. "She doesn't fit the image anymore," the recording said. "Once the baby comes, she'll fade out. Serena is the future." A collective intake of breath swept the ballroom. Madeline's knees weakened. Jonathan's hand moved instantly, steadying her elbow, not possessive, just present. The recording ended. No one spoke. Christopher looked around wildly, realizing too late that the room had shifted. Investors weren't impressed. They were calculating. This wasn't a scandal. It was liability. Jonathan faced the audience. "For those wondering," he said quietly, "this agreement was used to restrict her professional income, while her likeness was leveraged to soften executive perception. That makes it a governance issue." The implication landed hard. Christopher opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Madeline stared at the screen, tears blurring her vision not from shame but clarity. She had been erased on paper, systematically. Jonathan leaned closer to her and spoke softly, just for her. "This is the part where it stops." She believed him, because the power in the room had changed hands, and the people who once ignored Madeline were now realizing how much her silence had cost them. For a moment, no one moved. The recording still echoed in the silence, Christopher's own voice hanging in the air like a confession that couldn't be pulled back. The kind of truth that didn't need explanation. The kind that rewrote every polite smile in the room. Then the whispers started. They were no longer curious. They were sharp, urgent, calculating. Board members leaned toward one another, hands shielding mouths. Legal advisors quietly slipped out phones. Donors who had once laughed at Madeline now avoided looking in her direction, suddenly aware that they had been witnesses to something far darker than a party stunt. Christopher felt the shift before he fully understood it. He had built his power on perception, on the belief that he was controlled, progressive, untouchable. Now the perception was cracking, and with it, the invisible shield that had protected him for years. He scanned the faces around him, searching for allies. He found none. "Let's all take a breath," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "This is being misinterpreted. Private marital agreements are not corporate misconduct." Jonathan Pierce didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the front row, where two senior members of Langford Entertainment's board sat rigidly in their chairs. One of them, an older man with decades in the industry, met Jonathan's gaze and gave a slight nod. That was all Jonathan needed. "You're correct," Jonathan said calmly. "Private agreements are private until they intersect with company valuation, investor trust, and brand risk." End quote. He gestured subtly toward the screen, where Madeline's name still glowed beside the contract. "This agreement," Jonathan continued, "restricted a professionally trained vocalist from earning independent income, while her image was used to present stability during key funding rounds. Several of you invested during that period." The words landed like weights. A woman in a tailored white suit spoke up, her tone controlled but tense. "Are you suggesting misrepresentation?" Jonathan turned to her. "I'm suggesting that material information was withheld." The word material sent a visible ripple through the room. Christopher took a step forward, his composure cracking. "You're turning my marriage into a spectacle to undermine me." "No," Jonathan replied evenly. "You did that when you assumed she would stay quiet." Madeline stood beside him, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. She felt exposed, but no longer small. The fear had shifted. It was no longer hers. Serena Vale backed away slowly, instinct screaming at her to disappear. Her publicist whispered urgently at her side, face pale. Phones were already buzzing with messages, contracts, endorsements, damage control. Serena looked at Madeline then, really looked at her, and for the first time, there was no superiority in her eyes, only panic. A man near the stage cleared his throat. "As an investor," he said carefully, "I'd like to know whether this opens us to litigation." Jonathan answered without hesitation. "That depends on how quickly the board acts." Every head turned. Christopher felt something cold settle in his chest. "This is insane," he snapped. "You can't do this here." Jonathan finally raised his voice, not loud, but firm enough to cut through the chaos. "This is exactly where it happens, in front of the people who matter." He turned to Madeline. "You were told silence was loyalty," he said, "but silence was leverage. And tonight, that leverage is gone." Madeline met his gaze, tears burning but unshed. She nodded once. Across the room, a board member stood. Then another. Christopher watched them rise, one by one, and realized the truth too late. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. This was about removal. And the empire Christopher built was beginning to collapse under the weight of his own decisions. The boardroom instincts kicked in fast. What had begun as a glittering gala now felt like an emergency meeting held in evening wear. Voices overlapped in tight, urgent tones. Legal language replaced champagne chatter. Christopher Langford stood at the center of it all, suddenly aware that the room no longer revolved around him. He tried once more to regain control. "Everyone needs to calm down," Christopher said, lifting his hands slightly, the same gesture he used during market dips and PR scares. "This is being blown out of proportion. Personal matters are being weaponized." No one answered him. Instead, a woman from the board someone Christopher had personally recruited turned to Jonathan Pierce. "If this agreement restricted independent income while presenting spousal stability during fundraising," she asked carefully, "that exposes us." "To us, right?" Jonathan nodded once. "Yes." Another board member spoke. "And the audio?" "Authenticated," Jonathan replied. "Time-stamped. Verified." Christopher felt the floor shift beneath him. Madeline watched silently as the conversation moved around her, about her, because of her. For years, decisions had been made over her head. Tonight, those same people were realizing she was the missing variable they had never accounted for. Serena Vale was no longer part of the circle. She stood near the edge of the ballroom with her publicist, eyes darting, whispering furiously. Her phone buzzed nonstop, messages stacked, meetings canceled. When she looked toward Christopher, she didn't see partnership anymore, only liability. And when she looked at Madeline, she looked away just as quickly. Christopher noticed. Something sharp flickered through him. "You're enjoying this," he said to Madeline under his breath as he stepped closer. "You wanted this chaos." "Mistress." Madeline met his eyes steadily. Her voice was calm, quieter than his, but firm. "No, I wanted to be left alone. You didn't allow that." Jonathan shifted slightly, positioning himself between them without touching either. The message was clear. A senior board member cleared his throat. "We need to suspend public proceedings and convene immediately," he said. "Tonight." Christopher's head snapped up. "Suspend what?" "The executive vote," the man replied. "Effective immediately. Thanks for watching." The words hit like a physical blow. "You can't be serious," Christopher said. "This is my company." "It's a public company," another board member corrected. And perception just became risk. Around them, phones were already lighting up with breaking headlines. Whispers of removal and investigation floated through the room like sparks. Madeline felt her breath catch not in fear, but disbelief. She hadn't come here to destroy him. She had come prepared to survive humiliation. Instead, truth had done what endurance never could. Jonathan turned to her. "I need you to understand something," he said quietly. "None of this happens unless they believe you matter." She nodded, tears finally slipping free. "I didn't plan any of this." "I know," he said. "That's why it's working." Across the ballroom, Christopher stood alone now. No hand on his arm, no supportive nods, just distance, the kind that formed when power evaporated. A board member spoke again. "Christopher Langford, you are temporarily relieved of executive authority pending review." The room went silent. Christopher stared, stunned, rage and disbelief colliding on his face. "You'll regret this," he said hoarsely. Jonathan met his gaze without blinking. "No," he replied, "you will." Madeline placed a hand over her stomach, grounding herself as the world shifted around her. Because this was no longer a scandal. It was a reckoning. And as the board escorted Christopher away from the center of the room, Madeline realized this was only the beginning of what truth would take back. News doesn't wait for permission. By the time Christopher Langford was escorted away from the center of the ballroom, the first alerts had already hit phones across Manhattan. Headlines formed in real time, half-written but dangerous enough to detonate reputations. A CEO suspended. A hidden contract. A pregnant wife forced into silence. The story had teeth, and it was hungry. Madeline felt the shift before she saw it. People who had ignored her minutes earlier now watched her with careful distance. Not admiration. Not pity. Assessment. The kind reserved for someone whose presence might soon matter. Conversations lowered when she passed. Eyes followed her steps. Jonathan stayed close, not crowding her, just enough to signal that she was no longer alone in this space. Serena Vale was unraveling. Her publicist spoke rapidly into a phone, voice tight, face pale. A manager joined them, then another. Serena stood rigid, her face frozen in a mask that no longer convinced anyone. She had built her career on controlling narratives. Tonight, the narrative had slipped out of her hands. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down, and the color drained from her face. One sponsor, then another, then silence where offers used to be. She looked toward Madeline, panic sharpening into resentment. "This is your fault," Serena hissed under her breath as she passed. "You planned this." Madeline didn't raise her voice. "No," she said evenly. "I survived it." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Across the room, board members had clustered together, no longer pretending this was a social event. Legal counsel arrived, jackets on, expressions grim. This wasn't damage control anymore. It was containment. Jonathan watched it all with measured calm. "This will move quickly now," he told Madeline quietly. "They can't afford hesitation." She nodded, exhaustion creeping in now that the adrenaline was fading. Her hand rested on her stomach instinctively, grounding herself as the weight of the night settled. "What happens to him?" she asked. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. "That depends on what else surfaces." As if summoned, a journalist pushed forward, voice cutting through the noise. "Mr. Pierce," she called. "Can you confirm whether additional agreements exist involving Miss Vale?" Jonathan paused. "That information will be addressed through proper channels." But the damage was done. Serena heard it too. She staggered slightly, catching herself on a chair. She understood what that question meant. Investigations didn't stop at one contract. They widened. They connected dots she had hoped would stay invisible. Christopher watched from a distance, restrained by security and humiliation. His empire was already slipping from his grasp, piece by piece, faster than he could react. He locked eyes with Madeline once, fury and disbelief twisting his features. She didn't look away. For years, she had been trained to soften, to disappear, to absorb. Tonight, she simply stood. Jonathan leaned closer. "You did nothing wrong," he said quietly. "But you need to prepare. Once the truth starts moving, it doesn't slow down." Madeline exhaled slowly. "I'm not afraid anymore." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good, because this isn't over." Across the ballroom, Serena was escorted out, her heels clicking too loudly against the marble, cameras already flashing. She didn't wave, she didn't smile. The queen had fallen, and the room felt colder for it. Madeline watched her go, not with satisfaction, but clarity. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. And as the night fractured into investigations, exits, and whispered calculations, Madeline understood one thing with certainty. The life that had been taken from her was already finding its way back, and nothing could stop it now. By midnight, the gala no longer resembled a celebration. What remained inside the Plaza Hotel was a fractured room full of people calculating their exits, their statements, and their distance from Christopher Langford's name. The chandeliers still glittered, but the illusion was gone. Wealth could buy silence, but not tonight. Madeline sat in a quiet side lounge, a glass of water untouched in her hand. The adrenaline had drained from her body, leaving behind a deep, bone-level exhaustion. Her baby shifted gently, as if reminding her to slow down. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to sit, to breathe. Jonathan Pierce stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, precise sentences. Every few seconds, he glanced back at her, not out of control, but awareness. He understood moments like this. When power rearranged itself, the aftershocks were just as dangerous as the impact. Across the building, Christopher Langford faced reality for the first time without insulation. He was no longer surrounded by admirers or subordinates. Just two board representatives, a legal advisor, and the cold realization that his authority had been stripped in public. His phone buzzed constantly, partners, friends, contacts, who suddenly needed clarification. He ignored them all. The doors had closed. A senior board member spoke, voice flat. "We're initiating a full internal review. Your access to company systems will be suspended within the hour." Christopher scoffed weakly. "You're overcorrecting." "No," the man replied. "We're reacting late." That hurt more than anger. Back in the lounge, Madeline watched as a familiar face approached one of the donors, who had once dismissed her with a polite smile. Now his expression was cautious, respectful. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I didn't realize." Madeline nodded once. Most people didn't. He hesitated. If you choose to pursue independent representation, my foundation supports women returning to the arts." She didn't answer immediately. Not because she wasn't interested, but because for the first time, she wasn't desperate. The power to choose had returned to her. Jonathan returned, ending his call. "They're moving faster than expected," he said. Additional contracts surfaced. "Not just yours." Madeline's chest tightened. "Other women?" Jonathan nodded. "Not singers, different roles, same pattern." The scope of it settled heavily between them. Serena Vale's name appeared again, this time attached to an investigation into coordinated brand displacement. Her social media accounts went dark within minutes. No farewell, no explanation. Silence, where noise had once been currency. Madeline felt no triumph. Only confirmation. Jonathan studied her carefully. "You understand this may follow you," he said. "Public attention. Questions. Offers." "I know," she replied, "but it follows the truth now, not lies." He smiled faintly. "That's the difference." A message buzzed on Madeline's phone. A single line from an unknown number. You never belonged to his shadow. She didn't need to ask who sent it. Outside, reporters gathered behind barricades, hungry for statements. Inside, the board finalized interim leadership. Christopher Langford's name was already being spoken in the past tense. Madeline stood slowly, steadying herself. "What happens next?" she asked. Jonathan met her gaze. "Next, you decide who you are without permission." She placed a hand over her stomach, feeling the life she had protected through years of silence. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something she had to survive. It felt like something she was finally allowed to enter. And as the doors closed behind the fallen empire, Madeline stepped forward into a life that could no longer be taken from her. By the next morning, the story had evolved from scandal to reckoning. Madeline woke to the soft hum of Manhattan outside the hotel window, sunlight cutting across the room in pale strips. Her phone lay face down on the bedside table, vibrating intermittently with notifications she wasn't ready to read. She knew what they would say. Interviews, statements, requests framed as opportunities, curiosity disguised as concern. For now, she let the silence exist. Downstairs, Christopher Langford faced the collapse he had spent years engineering for others. His attorneys sat across from him in a private conference room, expressions professional but tight. Overnight, 3 more agreements had surfaced: internal memos, non-disclosure clauses, quiet payouts. The pattern was undeniable now. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was strategy. "You need to prepare for public separation from the company," one lawyer said carefully. "And personal exposure." Christopher laughed, sharp and hollow. "She ruined everything." The room went still. "No," the lawyer corrected. "You did." That truth cut deeper than anger ever could. Meanwhile, Serena Vale's fall was faster and more brutal. Paparazzi caught her leaving her apartment with sunglasses and a hoodie pulled low, no entourage in sight. Insiders leaked details within hours. Brand manipulation, replacement optics, coordinated silence, her image as a self-made star fractured beyond repair. The industry that once protected her now distanced itself with surgical precision. Madeline saw the headlines eventually. She didn't read the comments. Instead, she sat across from Jonathan Pierce in a quiet cafe, steam rising from untouched coffee. For the first time, there were no cameras, no board members, no microphones. Just honesty. "They're asking what you want," Jonathan said. "Statements, appearances, a path forward." Madeline considered this version of herself the woman people suddenly wanted to hear from. "I don't want to speak about him," she said finally. "Or her." Jonathan nodded. "That's a statement in itself." She met his gaze. "I want to speak about what happens when women are taught that silence is love." Jonathan studied her, respect clear in his eyes. Then, that's the story. Across town, Christopher watched the market open from a muted television screen. Langford Entertainment's stock dipped sharply, stabilizing only after the board announced interim leadership and a full compliance audit. His name was absent from the statement. Erased. He scrolled through his phone, messages dwindling with each refresh. Power, he realized too late, was only real when others believed in it. Without that belief, it vanished. Madeline stood at the edge of Central Park later that afternoon, coat pulled tight against the chill. Jonathan walked beside her, giving space, not direction. "You don't owe anyone redemption," he said quietly. "Just truth." She nodded. "I know. Thanks for watching." Her hand rested on her stomach, grounding her in something real, something untouched by contracts and cameras. Behind them, the city moved on. Ahead of her, a life waited unwritten, unrestrained. This chapter had closed with consequences, not chaos. And for the first time, Madeline understood that the most powerful ending wasn't destruction. It was freedom. Because when the masks fell, the only thing left standing was who she truly was, and that was more than enough. The days that followed were quieter, but heavier. Madeline moved out of the hotel and into a temporary apartment, arranged discreetly through Jonathan's office. It overlooked a narrow street in Manhattan, far from red carpets and cameras. The furniture was minimal, the silence unfamiliar. For the first time in years, no one told her where to be, what to wear, or how to smile. That freedom came with a cost. At night, when the city softened into distant sirens and muted traffic, the weight of everything she had endured pressed in. The contracts, the years of self-doubt, the moments she had apologized for existing too loudly. Trauma didn't disappear just because justice arrived. She woke from restless sleep more than once, hand pressed to her stomach, heart racing. Her doctor warned her gently about stress, about the importance of stability now. Madeline listened. She had spent too long ignoring her body for the comfort of others. Jonathan checked in without hovering. Some days, it was a text. Other days, a short call. Never demands, never pressure. He understood power, but more importantly, he understood restraint. Meanwhile, the fallout continued. Langford Entertainment formally removed Christopher from all executive roles. His access revoked, his signature voided. Former allies released carefully worded statements, distancing themselves from him. The man who once controlled rooms now struggled to get calls returned. Serena Vale attempted a comeback within days. A carefully staged apology appeared online, her voice trembling, eyes glossy. She spoke of misunderstandings, of pressure, of learning and growth. The response was brutal. Screenshots surfaced. Timelines were dissected. Silence from former collaborators spoke louder than any statement. The public didn't want remorse. They wanted accountability. Madeline watched none of it directly. Jonathan advised distance, and she trusted him. Instead, she focused inward. Breathing exercises, gentle walks, journaling thoughts she had never allowed herself to finish. One afternoon, she sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight warming her hands, and opened a notebook Jonathan had left for her without comment. On the first page, she wrote a single sentence. "I didn't disappear. I was buried." The words shook her. She realized then that the most damaging lie she had accepted wasn't Christopher's or Serena's. It was her own belief that endurance equaled love. That night, Jonathan visited briefly, standing near the doorway, respecting her space. "There's something you should know," he said carefully. "The board wants to offer you a formal apology and compensation." Madeline looked up. "I don't want hush money." He nodded. "I know. This isn't that. It's acknowledgement." She considered it. Not for revenge, not for pride, but for closure. "I'll listen," she said, "on my terms." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Of course." As he turned to leave, he paused. "You don't owe the world strength," he added. "Only honesty." After he left, Madeline stood by the window, watching the city glow. She felt fear still, yes, but it no longer ruled her. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future, not defined by recovery, but by choice. She placed both hands over her stomach, feeling a slow, steady movement beneath her palms. "I won't teach you silence," she whispered softly. Outside, Manhattan continued on, indifferent and alive. But inside that quiet apartment, something irreversible had shifted. Because Madeline was no longer rebuilding her life, she was reclaiming it, and the next step would change everything. Christopher Langford didn't call first. He showed up. It was late afternoon when the doorman buzzed Madeline's apartment. His voice was careful, almost apologetic. "There's a Mr. Langford here. He says it's urgent." Madeline closed her eyes. She had known this moment would come. Men like Christopher never accepted endings unless they controlled them. She rested a hand on her stomach, steadying herself, then nodded once. 10 minutes, she said. That's all. When he stepped inside, she barely recognized him. The confidence was gone. His suit was expensive but rumpled, his tie loosened, his eyes rimmed red with exhaustion and something closer to panic. This was not the man who once commanded rooms. This was a man standing in the wreckage of his own choices. "You look well," he said awkwardly, as if politeness could bridge the distance between them. Madeline didn't offer him a seat. "What do you want, Christopher?" she asked calmly. He swallowed. "I made mistakes. Things got out of hand. You know how pressure is. The board. The optics. Serena." "Stop," Madeline said quietly. The word landed harder than shouting. Christopher froze. "This is the first time you've spoken to me without performing," she continued. "Don't ruin it by lying." He stared at her, truly seeing her now, and something desperate flickered across his face. "I need you," he admitted. "If you clarify things publicly, say this was a misunderstanding, it could help stabilize the situation. For the company. For us." There it was. Not an apology. A transaction. Madeline felt no anger. Only clarity. "You're asking me to clean up what you broke," she said. "Again. This affects our child," he said quickly, reaching for the last card he had left. "My reputation matters." "Our child needs safety," Madeline replied evenly. "Not a father who values image over integrity." Christopher's voice cracked. "You're punishing me." "No," she said. "I'm choosing myself." Silence stretched between them, heavy and final. Christopher looked around the apartment, noticing the simplicity, the lack of luxury. "Jonathan Pierce put you here," he said bitterly. "Is that it now?" Madeline met his gaze without flinching. "He gave me options. You took them away." The truth settled over him like a weight. For a moment, he looked small. "I never thought you'd leave," he admitted. "You were always steady." "I was afraid," she corrected. "There's a difference. It's no for." He took a step toward her, then stopped, realizing too late that the power dynamic had reversed completely. "If you walk away," he said quietly, "you burn every bridge." Madeline smiled faintly. "I built my life by crossing bridges you set on fire." She moved toward the door and opened it. "Your 10 minutes are over." Christopher hesitated, then nodded stiffly. As he left, he turned back once, searching her face for regret. He found none. When the door closed, Madeline leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Her hands trembled not from fear, but release. The last chain had snapped. She walked to the window, sunlight spilling across the floor, and placed both hands over her stomach. "That was the past," she whispered. Outside, somewhere across the city, Christopher Langford was losing everything he thought defined him. Inside, Madeline felt something settle into place. Because the man who once erased her had just realized she no longer needed him, and what came next would be entirely on her terms. The fall didn't happen all at once. It came in waves, each one quieter than the last, each one stripping Christopher Langford of something he once believed was permanent. First, the board finalized the suspension. Then came the internal audit. Then the partners began to withdraw, not loudly, not dramatically, but efficiently. The kind of retreat that left no room for negotiation. Madeline learned about it the same way everyone else did. A headline flashed across her phone as she sat in a doctor's waiting room, hands folded over her stomach, listening to the steady rhythm of her child's heartbeat through the thin wall. Langford Entertainment announces, interim CEO, founder steps aside pending investigation. She didn't flinch. For years, Christopher's world had dictated her emotions. Today, it barely registered. Jonathan joined her later that afternoon, bringing paperwork and an update he delivered without satisfaction or cruelty. "They uncovered more than expected," he said carefully. "Financial manipulation, pattern misuse of personal agreements. The board is cooperating fully." "What happens to him?" Madeline asked. Jonathan paused. "He'll lose control, permanently, possibly more." Madeline nodded, absorbing it not as vengeance, but inevitability. Consequences had a way of arriving late, but they arrived all the same. Across the city, Christopher sat alone in a rented apartment far smaller than the penthouse he once ruled. Boxes lined the walls, unopened. His phone lay on the table, silent. The people who used to need him had learned they didn't anymore. He replayed the gala in his mind obsessively. The applause, Jonathan's voice, Madeline's calm refusal. For the first time, there was no one to blame convincingly but himself. Meanwhile, Serena Vale vanished from the industry overnight. No announcements, no farewell tour, just contracts quietly terminated and doors closed without explanation. The system that had protected her no longer saw value in the risk she represented. Fame, Madeline realized, was the most conditional form of power there was. That evening, Madeline sat alone at her kitchen table, reviewing documents Jonathan had sent, not demands, not traps, but options. A trust established for her and her child, full legal autonomy, a settlement structured as restitution, not silence. For the first time, she read every word, and for the first time, the language made sense. She signed nothing yet. Instead, she closed the folder and stepped onto the balcony, city lights stretching endlessly below. The air was cool, grounding. She rested her hands on the railing and let herself feel the weight of everything she had survived. She wasn't triumphant. She was free. Jonathan joined her quietly. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," he said. "I know," she replied, "but I know what I won't do." He waited. "I won't disappear again." He smiled, not relieved, not victorious, proud. Inside her, the baby shifted gently, steady and strong. Madeline closed her eyes, imagining a future where strength wasn't borrowed from endurance, but built from truth. Behind her, an empire collapsed without ceremony. Ahead of her, a life-weighted one she would no longer apologize for living. Because when the king fell, the woman he tried to silence finally stepped into a world that had no power over her anymore. Madeline didn't expect the invitation to come so quietly. It arrived as an email forwarded by Jonathan. Subject line simple and unassuming. No press release. No announcement. Just a request for a private meeting at a rehearsal hall on the west side of Manhattan. The kind of place artists used before the world noticed them, not after. She stared at the screen for a long moment. For weeks, people had been offering her things, money, apologies, platforms, protection. This felt different. It didn't ask her to explain the past. It didn't ask her to forgive it either. It asked her to imagine a future. The rehearsal hall was modest but immaculate, sunlight spilling through tall windows onto a polished wooden floor scarred by years of practice. A piano sat in the corner, lid open, waiting. The air smelled faintly of rosin and dust and possibility. Jonathan stood near the window when she arrived, hands in his pockets. "No cameras," he said. "No contracts today." Madeline nodded, grateful. She lowered herself into a chair, one hand resting on her stomach. The space felt safe in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "I'm not here to manage you," Jonathan continued, "or to shape you into anything." End quote. She looked up at him, searching for the catch. "I'm here because you deserve a choice you've never been given," he said. He gestured toward the piano. "There's an international foundation we're launching. Music, education, performance. Ownership stays with the artist. No image control clauses, no silence clauses." Madeline's breath caught. "You're offering me a position?" "A partnership," Jonathan corrected. "If you want it, as a performer when you're ready, as a mentor if you prefer, or both." The weight of the words pressed gently, not demandingly. "And if I say no?" she asked. Jonathan didn't hesitate. "Then you walk out with nothing owed." Something in her chest loosened. She stood slowly and walked toward the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. The sound wasn't needed. The gesture alone brought back memories, practice rooms, missed chances, a younger version of herself who thought giving everything away was the price of love. "I don't want to be saved," she said quietly. Jonathan met her gaze. "I know. That's why I'm not offering rescue." Silence settled between them, comfortable and respectful. Madeline closed her eyes and imagined her child years from now, watching her from the audience. Not as a symbol, not as a headline, just as a mother who didn't disappear. "I can't commit to anything until after the birth," she said finally. "And I won't perform for pity or spectacle." Jonathan smiled. "Good. I wouldn't let you." She turned from the piano, a small smile forming despite herself. "Then I'll say this," she said. "I'm interested. Not yes. Not yet. But open." Jonathan extended his hand, not to seal a deal, but to acknowledge her agency. She shook it, steady and sure. As she left the rehearsal hall, sunlight warmed her face, and for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a negotiation. It felt like a door she could open when she chose. And as Madeline stepped back onto the street, she sensed that the life waiting for her and her child was finally being built on freedom, not fear. The city slowed down for Madeline in ways she hadn't expected. After weeks of headlines, speculation, and quiet fallout, the noise finally began to fade. Not because people stopped talking, but because something newer always replaced yesterday's outrage. Scandals moved on. Markets adjusted. Names once spoken with certainty slipped into footnotes. Madeline welcomed the quiet. She spent her days carefully now. Mornings began with slow walks along tree-lined streets, doctor appointments, and intentional rest. Afternoons were for reading, writing, and gentle vocal exercises. Her physician approved nothing demanding, nothing forced. Just reminders to her body that her voice was still there when she wanted it. At night, she slept better. Not perfectly, but deeper than she had in years. Jonathan remained present, but unobtrusive. Some days he checked in. Some days he didn't. He never asked for reassurance or commitment. The offer stood quietly, patiently, exactly as promised. Across the city, Christopher Langford's life continued to contract. The investigation expanded. Former partners cooperated. The board finalized leadership changes. What had once been his empire now operated without his input, his access, or his approval. His name surfaced only in legal updates and restrained financial commentary. Power didn't scream when it disappeared. It simply stopped responding. Serena Vale attempted one final pivot. A low-budget interview appeared online, framed as reflection and growth. It lasted less than 24 hours before sponsors formally distanced themselves. The public wasn't cruel. They were done. And being ignored proved far harsher than being criticized. Madeline watched none of it directly. Instead, she prepared for something far more important. The baby arrived earlier than expected. It happened quietly, without cameras or announcements. One long night, one hospital room, one moment where fear returned briefly and then vanished. The second she heard that first cry, she cried too. Not from pain, from relief. When the nurse placed her child in her arms, the world narrowed to breath, warmth, and weight. This was real, untouched by contracts, untouched by image. Jonathan visited the next day, standing back respectfully as Madeline held her child. "You did it," he said softly. She smiled. "We did." Weeks passed in gentle rhythm. Feeding schedules, late-night pacing, small joys that felt enormous after years of constraint. Motherhood didn't erase her ambition, but it reordered it. Everything that mattered rose to the surface with clarity. One evening, as sunset colored the city, Madeline opened the notebook she'd been writing in since the gala. She turned to a blank page and wrote slowly, deliberately. "I am not returning to be seen. I am returning to be heard." She closed the notebook and looked down at her child, sleeping peacefully against her chest. Soon, she would make choices. About music, about partnerships, about the life she wanted to model. But tonight wasn't for decisions. Tonight was for stillness. The world that once demanded her silence no longer had a claim on her time, her body, or her voice. And as Madeline watched the city lights flicker on beyond the window, she understood something with quiet certainty. This was not the end of her story. It was the first chapter she would write without fear. The announcement didn't come through tabloids or breaking news banners. It appeared quietly on a respected Arts Foundation website, shared first among musicians, educators, and people who actually understood the weight of it. A single line, simple and understated. Madeline Brooks will return to the stage for a limited performance series supporting maternal health and arts education. No mention of scandal. No reference to Christopher Langford. No explanation owed. Still, the reaction was immediate. Within hours, invitations flooded in. Not desperate publicity grabs, but measured, respectful requests. Concert halls. Universities. Cultural institutions that valued credibility over spectacle. People who had waited years for a voice they never knew had been silenced. Madeline read them slowly, deliberately. She didn't rush. Jonathan sat across from her at the dining table, documents neatly stacked but untouched. Her child slept in the next room, the soft rhythm of breathing grounding her. "You don't have to do all of this," Jonathan said gently. Or any of it. I know, she replied. That's why I want to. End quote. Across the city and far from her thoughts, Christopher Langford's final reckoning arrived. The investigation concluded with findings that left no room for reinterpretation. Breach of fiduciary duty, misuse of personal agreements, ethical violations. The board issued a formal statement severing all remaining ties. His name was removed from company materials, historical records quietly revised. He watched the announcement alone. No anger this time. Just a hollow understanding of how completely the world had moved on. He thought of Madeline then, not as his wife, not as leverage, but as the woman he had underestimated until it cost him everything. Serena Vale fared no better. Her attempts to rebrand failed quietly. There were no dramatic cancellations, no public shaming, just absence. Invitations stopped arriving, calls went unanswered. The industry, efficient and unsentimental, had replaced her. Consequences didn't shout, they endured. Madeline stepped onto the stage weeks later at a mid-sized concert hall overlooking the city. No red carpet, no press pit, just an audience that rose instinctively when she appeared, not because of her story, but because of her presence. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, no performance armor. As she sang, the room changed. Not with shock this time, but recognition. This was not a comeback fueled by revenge. It was a return rooted in ownership. Each note carried steadiness, intention, and something deeper, choice. She wasn't proving anything. She was claiming space. Jonathan watched from the side, not interfering, not directing, just witnessing. When the final note faded, the applause was long and unforced. Madeline bowed once, hand over her heart, then exited without spectacle. Backstage, she picked up her phone and saw a single message waiting. You sounded like yourself. She smiled. Later that night, she stood by the window at home, city lights stretching endlessly below. Her child slept nearby. The future no longer felt like something she had to earn through suffering. She had already paid enough. Now, she was simply living. And as Madeline turned away from the window, she knew the final chapter would not be about survival, but about everything she had finally allowed herself to receive. The last time Madeline Brooks stood on a stage, there were no hidden traps, no watching eyes waiting for her to fall. The concert hall was full, but calm. No cameras flashed, no whispers followed her steps. Just an audience that had come for the music, not the story behind it. That distinction mattered more to her than applause ever could. Her child slept peacefully backstage, cared for by someone she trusted. The knowledge grounded her. She was no longer divided between who she was and who she protected. They were the same now. When Madeline sang, she didn't think about the past. She didn't think about Christopher Langford, whose name had quietly vanished from boardrooms and headlines alike. After the final ruling, he faded into professional obscurity, burdened by investigations and settlements that followed him wherever he tried to rebuild. No interviews, no redemption arc, just consequences he could not escape or outsource. She didn't think about Serena Vale either. The industry moved on without ceremony. New voices filled the space Serena once occupied. Her influence evaporated, not in scandal, but in irrelevance. The punishment she feared most arrived exactly as it should have, complete silence. Madeline sang for herself. Each note carried ownership, not endurance. She wasn't reclaiming a dream, she was living one that had never truly died. After the final performance, she didn't rush away. She stayed, greeting musicians, thanking organizers, holding her child with a quiet smile. The life she now lived wasn't loud, but it was real. Later that night, she stood on her apartment balcony, city lights stretching endlessly below. Jonathan Pierce joined her. Not beside her, but slightly behind where support belonged. "You're free," he said simply. Madeline nodded. "I know." They didn't need to define what they were becoming. There was no rush, no imbalance, no power to negotiate. Just respect that grew naturally, like trust rebuilt from solid ground. She looked down at her child, then back at the city. "I used to think happiness meant being chosen," she said quietly. "Now I know it means choosing myself." Jonathan smiled, saying nothing. He understood. In the months that followed, Madeline built a life that didn't require explanation. She performed selectively. She mentored quietly. She raised her child without fear that love came with conditions. The world that once silenced her had moved on. She had not. And that was the difference. There were no loose ends left behind, no unresolved debts, no shadows reaching for her future. The past had closed cleanly, exactly where it belonged. Madeline Brooks was no longer someone's wife, someone's problem, or someone's secret. She was a woman who survived, stood up, and walked forward without looking back. And as she closed the door on that final night, holding her child close, she knew with complete certainty this story had ended exactly where it should have. So the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with us right now, truly still here, then something in this journey has touched your heart in a quiet but real way. Maybe you saw a part of yourself in Madeline. Maybe you recognized the feeling of staying silent too long, of shrinking to survive, of believing that endurance was the same as love. The lesson of this story isn't about revenge or winning. It's about reclaiming yourself. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Healing begins the moment we stop asking the world for permission to exist as we are. It begins when we choose dignity over fear, truth over comfort, and self-respect over approval. Life will test us with unfairness, with people who benefit from our silence. But as Epictetus reminded us, no one can harm you without your consent. The moment you stop consenting to being diminished, everything changes. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something you've been carrying quietly, please take a second to like this video. Share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, awaken, and remind us all. You are allowed to choose yourself.